Hello Internet! Welcome to yet another video where I make something kinda geeky with my laser cutter. Today I am making another wooden topographical map, and this time it's a world map from Final Fantasy VII. This whole endeavor started when I got Final Fantasy VII on my Switch. It has been so long since I last played this game, and it was a real nostalgia trip. Probably about halfway through what would have been Disc 2, when I got the tiny Bronco, I first found myself really yearning for a map. I googled a world map for reference, and right then and there I was like, holy crap, I should make a map of Final Fantasy VII Gaia! So that's what I'm doing right now. For once, I actually remembered to record the whole process of making the vector art, but of course, it took a couple hours to do, so I'll be speeding through that and cutting out a bunch of stuff for the sake of this not being an obscenely long and boring video. I started by looking through a bunch of different world maps I found via Google and trying to determine which seemed like good matches to the actual game world, as well as which ones would be the most useful reference for making layers off of. So I started with outlining the borders of the first layer of land. I use the pencil tool and I draw it with my mouse. I'm not even using a pen tool here. Shorelines are usually very squiggly, and I find I actually get better results with this than trying to be super exact with the pen tool. One thing that Illustrator does, however, is sort of round out and simplify pencil-drawn lines that get too long, so I have to regularly stop and go back over the lines to better refine them. If you have a vector line selected or highlighted already and then draw over that line with the pencil tool, it actually adjusts the existing line with the changes rather than making a new line. After I had all of the base layer landmass traced, I started working on each additional level. I used different colors for each level just to try and help myself keep track of things as I went. With each continent done, I moved on to the next and just kept going from there. Okay, so I have all of the land outlines done, but I wanted some more details on this map, like trees and shorelines. For that, I referenced a different map I found through Google that had more cosmetic details, even if it didn't have any good height information. Of course, things didn't line up perfectly, none of the maps I found actually matched each other, but they were close enough. I wanted to include the shorelines because they're important to the game's actual traversal. The shores are the only places that you can go onto the land when you're in the tiny Bronco, so knowing where they are is important. So this is the part where I started making text labels. If you've seen any of the other topographic maps that I've made, you'll know that I do all of my text labeling this way. Basically, for the sake of not taking a couple hours to cut and etch every one of these, I do whatever I can to avoid raster etching. I prefer to stick to 100% vector lines because this is just so much faster. Fonts are filled in shapes, which have to be etched. And if I tell the laser to trace the vector outlines of each letter, it is a horrid mess and you can't read it. So instead, I manually draw, in vector lines, each individual letter of the alphabet. I make a set of uppercase letters and lowercase letters, and then I just copy and move them into place to make every single word. It's a bit tedious, but it's upfront effort that pays off in time saved later on, so it's worth it. There are various spots around the world where you can catch a chocobo. I wanted to mark each of these spots with a little graphic of a chocobo, so I found a couple good images that I thought were a good look, and I sort of mishmashed the two together. Before actually placing the words, I went through and put circles to indicate each of the locations on the map. And finally, it was time to actually put the words into place. I also realized that I missed a couple location names. I pieced those together real quick and put them where they belonged. Raster etching is where the laser's software takes a black and white image and goes back and forth, left to right, on for black, off for white, to etch the image into the wood. It is much slower than vector etching, so I keep it to a minimum. The one place I used it was the Final Fantasy logo, but everything else was just vector lines. Okay, not entirely true. I also used raster etching for the details on these border pieces. I've cut the rest of the match and even the back piece out of 1/8 inch plywood, which is admittedly kind of thin. I wanted the border pieces to have a bit more thickness to them, so they're being cut out of 1/4 inch plywood instead. But I don't have any 1/4 inch plywood that's larger than a foot square, and the long pieces at least need to be longer than a foot, so I've split them in half and hopefully it won't be too distracting. Sanding! Here I'm sanding the base piece, border pieces, and the land masses that are large enough to use a radial hand sander on them. Unfortunately, there are plenty of pieces that are just too small to use the radial hand sander, so I've got to do them manually. So I know many people would think it's sensible to just glue everything together first and then apply the polyurethane finish over top of that. But I'm a masochist, so I can't possibly do the sensible thing. Truth is that I'm after a high gloss, super smooth finish, and to get that, I need to be able to sand everything after the first coat of poly and then apply a second coat. If the pieces are glued together, sanding them smooth becomes extremely difficult, if not outright impossible. So I actually apply the poly coating to each and every single piece individually. Then I can sand them individually and apply the second coat of poly. At that point, everything will be shiny and smooth just how I want it. Only then do I start gluing things together. It's tedious and time-consuming, but the impact on the final product is significant enough that I think it's justified. So jump ahead to the next day, and all of the polyed pieces are dry, so it's time to do the second pass of sanding I mentioned. Same as before, any piece large enough gets sanded with the radial hand sander. The grit of the sandpaper is higher now than it was before, so I'm smoothing that poly coating as much as possible. And here I go through the process of sanding the tiny pieces by hand with sandpaper. I'm using a high grit sandpaper here too. Once I'm ready to start putting the second coat of poly, I try to wipe away as much of the sanding dust as possible. For any deeper etched areas, like the Raster logo here, I use compressed air to blow out the dust. For these larger rastered areas, I really load up the foam brush and sort of gently press the polyurethane into the space to make sure I saturate it really well. I load up the brush with more poly virtually every single stroke, and I go a lot slower and more meticulous this time than the first coat. Laying it down as smoothly as possible is really important to get that smooth gloss shine with only 2 coats. If you see a lot of bubbles on the surface, you can try blowing on them to pop them, and try switching to a fresh foam brush. As I go, I lay the smaller pieces out onto a piece of cardstock. This way, when I run out of room, I can just lay the whole thing onto a level drying rack in one smooth go. Applying poly to all of the tiny individual pieces is tricky since they often want to just stick to the foam brush. I actually hold them down with a toothpick and just sort of squeeze a bit of poly out of the brush and onto the piece with little dabbing motions. To speed this process up, I usually lay out a whole big batch of the tiny pieces and do them all in one go. Another time skip and it's the next day. Everything has dried and I've successfully gotten the super high gloss shine I was after. Yay! That means that it is now time to glue things together. Although first I'm going to start laying everything out into proper places. This whole process is pretty time consuming. So many of the smaller pieces look nearly the same, and since just finding the pieces and placing them takes so long, I want to try and get as much of it sorted out as possible first and then start to glue afterwards. I haven't gotten everything in place yet, but I've got the bulk of it, so I'm ready to actually start gluing things. I pour a puddle of wood glue onto a little plastic wrapped block of scrap wood, and I use a toothpick to apply the wood to each of the tiny pieces. I generally start with the smallest top layer pieces first and work my way down from there. An hour or so later, and I've finished gluing all of the bits and pieces onto the surface, and I'm ready to turn my attention to the border. I started by using blue painter's tape to just hold the edges together in the right shape. Then I checked from the top to line everything up correctly. More blue painter's tape to hold things in place, flip it over, and some quick pencil lines to use as a guide. I removed the tape and started to apply glue onto the back pieces and smooth it out with yet another toothpick. And I used these little clamps to hold everything into place so the glue could set. And holy crap, that's it! I can put some mounting hardware on the back if I want, but the border actually provides a totally usable lip for hanging this thing onto nails. So I don't even really need the extra hardware. I love how the finish came out. It was totally worth the extra tedium for that smooth shine. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to leave a like because it actually does make a big difference. Check out my channel for more things like this, and you can check out my Etsy shop for products like this and many more. Subscribe for more videos, and I will see you guys soon. Thanks for watching. Bye-bye.